All right. All right, well, welcome. Hopefully this will be an enjoyable session. It is all numbers, okay? So once again, those of you that are afraid of numbers, too bad, so sad, but tonight it's all about numbers. So let's just start off with a simple question. You know, you've heard this question about, you know, real estate and what it's all about and that sort of thing, that typical answer of, you know, what's the most important thing in real estate, the whole location, location, location. But that's not what this is about tonight. What we're really concerned with is what gives commercial investment real estate its value. And so, in your minds, if it's not location, what would give commercial investment real estate value?
It's inside. What do you invest inside the property?
It's a good answer, but no.
Like viability.
In what way?
Like if it'll gives, I mean, like enough income will be made.
Okay, stop right there. Income. That's what gives it value. What is the income that it will generate over a year, over 5 years, over whatever your holding period is as an investor? And so that's what really, truly gives the commercial real estate investment its value, is what is that income, okay? But what we try to do is kind of refine that in terms of, well, what does income really mean? Because, you know, a simple example would be, all right, you own a condo and you rent out that condo to somebody. They pay you monthly rent, all right? Do you get to keep 100% of that monthly rent that they pay to you as the owner?
No.
Okay, who do you potentially have to pay things to? The mortgage?
Taxes.
Potentially utilities, if they're not included?
Taxes.
What, sorry?
Taxes.
Property taxes, and also federal income taxes. Okay, what else?
HOA.
Homeowners association fees. Okay, what else? Property management fees, property maintenance fees. Okay, what, sorry? Okay, so the point is, what we try to do with this is to find out what are all those other forms of expenses, what are all the different types of income that can be generated off of a commercial property that are going to influence its value. All right, does that make sense? Okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to start with a really simple example. So the first handout, all right, the one that's just simply titled, Simple Example of a Commercial Real Estate Property Valuation. Take a look at that real quick. Just kind of scan over the first sort of little question. And this will kind of get us started. And see if you can kind of figure out what we're asking. We're going to work through this example together, and then we're going to move into this little bit more complex stuff and so forth and so on. So the scenario is, assume that you've recently inherited $300,000 that you would like to invest in an income-producing commercial real estate investment. Okay, so that's the initial assumption. Now, why is that important, that dollar amount?
Does that money you have to invest?
That's the money that you have available to invest, okay? Now, here's the way we have to begin to think about that. Are you limited to buying a property that you would just simply pay $300,000 for? Yes or no? No. Why?
Because you don't know and spend $200,000. It's just the whole amount you have available.
Well, okay, the $300,000 is what you have available to put into a property, okay? But why might you be able to buy a more expensive property?
Oh.
Because of what?
You can get a loan.
You can get a loan, okay? And begin to leverage that investment, okay? Leverage that equity that you're putting into the property. Okay, so there are a couple of different terms that we use to describe kind of the money that goes into a commercial real estate investment. One is debt, one is equity, okay? Equity is the dollar amount that you, as the investor, are putting up, okay? So in this case, that $300,000 is representing equity. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Yes or no? Okay. Another way to look at it, it's a down payment. All right? Now, the debt is, of course, the money that we're going to borrow. All right? But we have to figure out how much can we borrow if we have that dollar amount. Well, what's going to determine that? Any ideas? How much you're able to borrow? Well, yes, how much, obviously the dollar amount from the down payment, but that alone is not the sole determining factor. What other variable, at a minimum? Credit, what else?
Financial history.
Financial history, but what else?
Interest rates.
I'm sorry?
Interest rates.
Potentially interest rates? I'm sorry?
What you're buying.
Yeah, to a certain extent that's going to be impactful, but it's also going to be determined by what the actual lending standards are for the bank or financial institution or whoever's fronting up the money for the debt. Does that make sense? Because every lender is different. One of probably the most fundamental things to get into your head is every bank is like a retailer. And what I mean by that is whenever you went shopping for your calculator, you may have looked at several different sources online, maybe a couple of different places in person, and you probably found different prices, yes? Maybe slightly different prices, and in some cases maybe really big differences in price. And so each one of those retail institutions maybe had a different price on the calculator that you wanted to buy. But the institution that you chose, the retail institution that you chose, that maybe had the lowest price, do they necessarily have the lowest price on every single conceivable retail product on the market? No. They probably specialize, or they probably promote one product over another in order to get people in the door. My point is, lenders do the same thing, okay? In other words, just because you maybe go to Wells Fargo and you have this wonderful relationship with Wells Fargo as a bank, and you've got a car loan, maybe with Wells Fargo that's at a really good interest rate, it's an amazing interest rate. They already have all of your financial information as a borrower. And so, much like you treat normal retailers, you sort of say, hey, I'm going to bank with Wells Fargo, and any sort of loans that I may get are going to come from Wells Fargo because just customer loyalty, if nothing else, okay? But what you probably would find is that maybe whenever you want to get a home loan, Wells Fargo may not have the best deal. The best deal might be at Bank of America for a home loan. But then if you went to go find a loan for maybe a small 4-unit apartment complex, you might find that another financial institution has a better deal on that. You follow what I'm getting at? So part of it is, yes, shopping around is one thing, but to think of lenders like that, because unfortunately, in most people's minds, they tend to have this envisionment that all lenders are created equal, all of them are offering the same exact deal, and there's no real variation between them, okay? And nothing could be farther from the truth, okay? So keep that in perspective. So getting back to our little problem. So in question 1, I simply say, assume that the local commercial real estate lenders are typically loaning up to 80% debt of an income-producing property's valuation. All right, so what does that mean? They're loaning 80% of the property's valuation.
You should have to come up with 10%.
Okay. You still potentially have to come up with 20% as your down payment. Okay? But that also means, okay, this is, pick a number out of the sky. So let's say that we find a property that is on the market and has been valued at $1 million. What would that mean would be the maximum loan amount that you could get on that property? $800,000. Okay, which means that you would need how much as a down payment? $200,000. Okay, everybody see the logic in that? Okay, so now in this one, what we're actually told is we've got $300,000. We have $300,000 in equity. So what we could do to kind of back into the valuation of the property would be to do what? Those of you with decent math skills, what would you do?
Divide that by 20%.
Divide that by 20%. All right? And so what that's going to do, that's going to give you what as a dollar amount? 1.5 million. So in essence, what we're saying is that's the value of the property, or the maximum value of the property that we could afford with this lender because of their stipulation that they're willing to lend with an 80% loan to value ratio or requiring 20% equity. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay? So now, the next little piece of that is saying, okay, well that means your equity investment would represent 20% of the valuation. Yeah. What would be the maximum amount that you could pay for the investment property? We've answered that, 1.5 million. Now, the second piece, how much would that mean you could borrow in this scenario? The difference, okay? Or, you simply take this, multiply it by the 80%, and that's going to give you what? 1.2 million. So 1.2 million is going to be your debt, 300,000 is going to be your equity, 1.5 million is going to be the overall value of the property. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Is there anything about that that doesn't make sense? Okay, you understand the math that we did and why we did what we did, and okay. Now, I don't ask this on the question sheet, but what if we had a different lender with different standards, okay? And let's say that another lender, a competing lender, required, instead of a 20% down payment, they required, I don't know, a 25% down payment. All right, how would that change everything? Well, so we kind of repeat what we did. In this case, take 300,000, and now divide by 25%.
1.2.
Okay. Yep. And that would also mean that you could borrow 75%, right? Because if you're basically putting up 25%, then the remaining 75% would be what you could borrow. So that means 900,000 would be now the debt. The value would be 1.2 million, and then the equity is still 300,000. Now, what lesson can we learn from this in terms of shopping around? Just one key feature. What is the required equity, or what is the required down payment, and how is that going to impact how much you can borrow? I mean, don't you think it's a pretty significant difference? So you go from basically being able to borrow 1.2 million or buy a property worth 1.5 million to only being able to borrow 900,000 with the overall value of the property being 1.2 million. So in other words, that's a $300,000 difference in the value of the property. Is that not significant? Very significant, okay? Now, this is one of those sorts of things that from one lender to the next can change. And it's very realistic for it to be substantially different. That you could have, and it also is dependent upon the kind of property that you're looking at, whether it's residential, like in terms of multifamily, or whether it's maybe a shopping center, whether it's an office building, or something else, may dictate what that down payment requirement is. And also, that down payment requirement may be dictated by sort of the credit score of the borrower, or the underlying financial dynamics of the property and how stable that income is off of that property and how stable that property type is. What property type would you not want to buy right now? Of all the property types probably out there and available in the market, what property type would probably be not the best to buy right now? What? I'm not hearing a single answer that I would agree with. Retail. Who in their right mind right now would be buying retail property? We have clearly a retail apocalypse happening, and it has been happening, and is only going to continue to get worse, okay? Because what? We're buying virtually everything online. I mean, what about you? Do you buy most everything that you need online, or do you still literally go to the store and buy it?
I literally like going to the store.
Well, you're the exception, okay?
I go on Amazon for that.
Exactly.
Amazon.
I buy virtually every possible, with the exception of like frozen goods from the grocery store. Every other thing I pretty much buy is on Amazon, you know? And it's logical because I don't want to have to necessarily deal with the inconvenience of going to the store and dealing with all that. I've had something right to my front door. I love it. I think it's great. And I would argue that most people feel the same way. So my point is, you've got hundreds of thousands of millions of square feet of retail space all over the world that in relatively short order is basically becoming obsolete or useless, or is going to have to be completely rethought of and repositioned in some way, okay? Now, if you can find what that magic formula is for maybe repositioning some of that retail real estate, then it may be a great time to buy that property. If you can find some alternative use once the market has really fully kind of cratered for retail property, then that may make sense. But otherwise, buying it for traditional retail use doesn't make really any sense, okay? Now, there are a handful of retail uses that are stable that you may or may not think of as retail uses, like restaurants. That's a retail use, okay? You know, same thing, bars and clubs, also retail use, okay? Where, so, you know, in those instances, you can sort of say, yeah, all right, those, you pretty much have to go to those in order to get the benefit that you want from them. Outside of restaurants, yeah, you can order, have food delivered, but for a bar and a club and that sort of thing, don't think you're gonna be doing that from home, you know, or at least not in a way that would make a whole lot of sense. Okay, now, just take a look at this next little piece, all right? So the second part is, and all these are connected, okay? The questions are connected on purpose. So in this case, you find yourself wanting to buy a small 10-unit apartment complex containing only one-bedroom efficiency units that are leasing at $1,000 a month and rent for a total potential gross income, PGI, of $12,000 per unit or $120,000 overall, okay? So I've basically given you the answer for the first piece of this. This is basically what we call an income statement for the real estate. And the first piece of that income statement is we start off with what's called potential gross income. And what that number really means is this is the maximum rental revenue that you could generate off of this property over the course of a year. Does that make sense? Okay, so in this case, the number that I have given you of $120,000 is pretty much simply taking, you've got each unit generating $1,000 a month times 12 months in a year, which would be $12,000 per unit per year, times 10 units, which gives you the 120,000 potential gross income. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions about that? All right. So that gives us our potential gross income. All right. So from that, we're going to subtract out vacancies and collection losses. Any idea what the difference is between a vacancy and a collection loss?
Collection loss is when you have to deal with like kicking somebody out and all that.
Yeah, it's like a deadbeat tenant. You've got somebody that's actually living in the space or occupying the space, leasing the space, but they're not paying rent. Okay, that's a collection loss. Whereas a vacancy is simply the property is empty, no one's living in it. You know, so there is a difference there. Now, in terms of our income calculations, there's really no difference because we're not getting money from the deadbeat tenant, we're not getting money if the rental unit were unoccupied. So it's more of just simply looking at this, what is that dollar amount that we are having to kind of subtract out? Well, in this case, we're told, assume that over a typical year, there's a 10% vacancy and collection loss for the property. All right? 10% of what? That potential gross income. Okay? So in this case, all you're going to do is multiply 120,000 times the 10% vacancy and collection loss, and that's going to give you $12,000. All right, does that make sense? Okay. The next piece is other income. All right. So in this case, assume the property generates $1,000 a year in other income from vending machines, laundry machines, etc. All right. So think about that one for a minute. This is kind of cool because in addition to the rental revenue that you're getting off the property, in terms of rental, in terms of renting the units, you're also getting this extra little bit of other income from these ancillary sort of services. Well, what's interesting about that is, especially as you get into larger and larger properties, there can be some really cool, really profitable ancillary services that you can charge in terms of income, and so that can be a bigger and bigger piece of your total income from the property. Does that make sense? For example, one of the ones I didn't mention was like parking structures. Okay? So if you've got covered parking, and this is like a huge deal where I came from in Texas, where almost every year, just like you guys have a hurricane, you know, in Texas, the big deal, you have a hailstorm. Okay, where, you know, obviously rains ice from the sky, okay? And usually those pieces of ice can be as big as a baseball. I mean, you know, so literally will destroy your car, okay? So most people are willing to avoid the hassles of insurance and everything else to pay a little bit extra per month for a parking structure. Well, the point with that, without getting into a lot of excruciating detail, is assume that you could charge somebody $25, $50 a month just to have covered parking, okay? In addition to the rental income that you're getting off of the units. That would have a huge impact in the overall value of the property because of that extra source of income. Does that make sense? Okay, but what's more interesting about it is the cost to actually build that parking and to finance that parking structure might only cost you $5 a month. So if you're charging them $25 a month to actually park there, you're going to be making $20 per space per month, pure profit, with no maintenance or really upkeep cost. Does that make sense? Okay? And so what happens, especially with a lot of larger sort of apartment communities, is they figure out some of the most creative ways to generate these extra sources of income and what people are really willing to pay for extra and above whatever their normal rent might be. Like for example, have any of you ever lived in like a, I don't want to use the word skyscraper, but let's just say a tall residential building? Any of you? Okay, one of the differences you probably encountered was they charge you more if you have a higher floor. Or they charge you more if you have a better view. Or they charge you more if you have, a bigger balcony or whatever it is. This is exactly what I'm sort of talking about. It's ways to think of creative ancillary sources of income above and beyond. Now granted, all of that would be pretty much contained in the normal rent, but the point is, it's an extra sort of feature that adds value to the property. Okay, make sense? All right. So we do the basic math on this, and that gets us effective gross income, or EGI, of $109,000. All right. Now, the way that I like to sort of explain EGI, or effective gross income, is this is sort of like the hard cash currency that you get to touch, feel, smell, and ultimately put into a bank account of some sort. Does that make sense? Okay? So after everything is sort of said and done, this is the money that you have really generated. Before we start subtracting out expenses and that sort of thing, this is the hardcore currency sort of coming in the door. All right, so the next line item is to deal with the operating expense aspect. Okay? Now in this case, we simply say, all right, assume that the total operating expenses, TOE, for this property are 35% of the effective gross income. All right? So what we're going to do is we're going to take that effective gross income of $109,000, multiply that by 35%. We're going to talk about that here in just a second. 38. Okay, yep. So 38,150. Our total operating expenses. Now, we talked a little about this earlier. What are some of those operating expenses? Is that what you got? 38,150?
Yeah.
Okay. So what are some examples of operating expenses? We talked about this earlier. Property taxes, property maintenance, property management, potentially HOAs, okay? Utilities, if the property owner is paying for them, okay? What else?
Lawn maintenance.
Any sort of landscaping, that sort of thing, okay? Everybody good with that? Yes? Now, here's the thing that we could, once again, you could really delve into if you wanted to, but how would you, in your own words, you've heard this term before, how would you define what a slumlord is? Yeah, you've heard that term before, yes? What word would you, or what words would you use to describe what a slumlord is? If somebody said, this person is a slumlord, what does that mean? No, not necessarily lazy.
Cheap.
Cheap is probably the right word, okay? That they own property, they're your landlord, but they tend to not want to pay for anything. They tend to not want to do the regular maintenance that needs to be done on the property to keep it in good working order. If you ever lived in a property where, things weren't being repainted when they needed to be, carpet wasn't being replaced when it needed to be, a whole number of black mold issues or leaks or whatever might be the issue, but the idea is that they weren't necessarily, that property owner was not willing, for whatever reasons, to make those necessary repairs. Well, why do you think they weren't?
They want to keep their money.
They want to keep the money. It's as simple as that. Because as you're going to see, as we sort of subtract out, if we raise those expenses by a few $1,000s, all of a sudden that changes the whole dynamic of whether this property is profitable or not. But let's flip this around another direction. What if you live in a property where they go to the other extreme? super high end, you know, everything is so well maintained, it's absurd, okay? You know, not a blade of grass is out of place, you know, everything is perfectly manicured, everything is perfectly maintained, and they clearly, you know, are on top of every possible conceivable issue imaginable. Now, chances are, they're having to pay to accomplish that. Well, what is that going to do to their rate of return? Probably push it down. But it may also have the impact of doing what? Keeping tenants and keeping them happy, and whenever they come in with a rental increase, probably being okay with that. As opposed to being the other situation where you have the slumlord that doesn't really take care of anything, and slumlord comes along and says, hey, I'm going to raise your rent by another, you know, 5 or 10% this year. You're going to be like, no, you know, you haven't done all these things I want you to do. Okay, make sense? All right. So we do the basic math here. And this gets us down to what we refer to as a net operating income. In this case, $70,850. All right, this is the magic number that for the most part you want to be able to get to on a commercial piece of real estate, okay? Because this is a number that reflects the income the property is generating, the vacancies, the other income, the operating expenses, and so this is kind of the real number that, okay, I kind of get to keep this amount with the exception of paying for a loan, with the exception of paying for income taxes and that sort of thing. But this number, and the reason this number gets used so much is because it's easily comparable between investors. You're saying, why? Well, if you listen to what I just said, the only thing that's going to come out of net operating income, if we keep subtracting things out, as we talked about earlier, is going to be your loan payment. Well, think about that. The loan payment that you get, the loan that you get is probably going to be different than the loan that you get, different than the one you get, and you get because you go to different lenders, you have different credit scores, you have different experiences, you have different down payments, all of that, okay? And so it really doesn't make sense to compare sort of apples to apples on commercial properties sort of below the net operating income number unless you're doing it for a specific investor. Does that make sense? Okay? And same thing on the tax implications because each of you has maybe a different marginal tax rate associated with what you're paying. So this number is the number that really fundamentally gets used the most in terms of determining what the actual value of the property is. Okay? Does that make sense conceptually? Yes or no? Question?
Yeah, so the NOI is what the tax bracket is based on and not the EGI.
No. The tax bracket is going to be based on the individual investor, okay, or the entity that owns the real estate. So, for example, you may own a piece of real estate as an individual, okay? You're going to be taxed at whatever your marginal tax rate is based upon whatever income that you have both as a salary as well as investment income, okay? But if you buy this as a partnership, okay, let's say the two of you, buy this together, a 50-50 partnership, well, chances are both of you have different marginal tax rates. Let's say that you've got a massive salary, in addition to the income being generated off of the property. But let's say, okay, you're currently a student, you don't have a salary, but you co-own this with him, and because of that, you're going to be in a lower tax bracket in terms of your marginal tax rate, so you're going to pay less dollars in tax than you will, barring other issues and complications and deductions and whatever else that might be incurred. But just on par, that would be the case. Does that make sense? Now, also, you may have bought this property as a corporation. You may have bought it as a,
LLC.
I'm sorry?
As a limited liability company.
As a limited liability company, an LLC. You could have bought it as part of a real estate investment trust. I mean, there's a whole variety of different ways that you can actually buy and own real estate. And so the point being is, depending on that particular ownership entity set of characteristics, that will dictate what your tax rate's going to be. okay? And it can be huge, okay, in terms of the difference. All right, so let's just go ahead and follow through what we've got here. And so this gets us through that sort of that second little piece, okay? Now, we move on to the third piece, and we introduce a new concept called the capitalization rate, or cap rate. How many of you have ever heard that term before, cap rate? Anybody? Okay, handful of you, all right. So let's just talk about this. This fundamentally, whenever I said earlier, what gives commercial investment real estate its value, it's the cap rate. Well, we have a nice, simple little model that kind of represents this relationship. And I refer to it as ERV, simply because we have income, cap rate or rate of return, and V for value, okay? And the way this works, so this income is basically our net operating income. This rate is our cap rate or rate of return. And the V is the value. And the value could be investment value, could be market value, could be insurable value, could be replacement value, could be a whole number of different types of value. We're going to talk a little bit about some of that here as well. But the way this model works is we need to know 2 of the 3 variables to solve for the third. Okay, so in this particular example, we know the annual net operating income is $70,850. Okay, so that just simply goes up here in this top piece. Now the way this model works, and the reason why I sort of express it this way, because it makes it really easy to remember. So if we want to solve for the value, all we really do, we can just put our hand over that and say we're solving for value, and the formula is simply income divided by rate gives us value. Does that make sense? Okay, if we wanted to solve for the rate, income divided by value gives us the rate. If we want to solve for the income, then it's rate times value. Okay, does that make sense? And all that's pretty much written right there in that piece, okay? So in this particular case, and we're going to talk about this cap rate here in just a second, but let's just say, assume that the standard capitalization rate for this type of property is 5%. What is the implied value of the property? So we're going to go ahead and pop in the 5% over here, okay? So let's just do the calculation and then we're going to explain it. Okay, 70,850 divided by 0.05 or 5% would give us a value for this property of $1,417,000. Okay? Do the calculations make sense? I'm going to go through and explain the terminology now. Okay. So, let's start with cap rate or capitalization. Yeah.
You said divide 0.05?
Okay, so just think of it like a math problem. That in this case, what you're doing is you're simply saying that divided by that gives us this. Okay? Or if you were searching for the cap rate, we would do that divided by that gives us this. If we're doing the income, it's this times this gives us, okay? And all that's written down there on the sheet. Okay, now, the cap rate. Let's talk about what that is and what it represents. So, as I mentioned, the full term is simply called capitalization rate. And what it really is trying to embody is what is the rate of return on an annual basis that this investment would need to generate in order to attract capital to it. In other words, to attract investors to it. So what we're saying is that for this kind of property, it needs to throw off a minimum of a 5% annual rate of return. Does that make sense? Okay, now what do we mean in that terms of that 5%? What is that really representing? Okay, any of you, well, this example may not work with this generation, but in previous generations, you were able to open a savings account and actually get a rate of return on that savings account of something greater than 5 or 6% in some instances. Now, your best bet on a savings account is probably what, 1 or 2 or 3% at the most, something like that. Okay, but you get the general idea. Okay, that all that really is saying is, in order, whenever you put money into a savings account, you get some sort of an annualized rate of return or percent. That's basically all this really is on the real estate side of things, is saying, what is that rate of return that you would need to invest in real estate? Well, part of that motivation, part of that reason that you would invest in that property is hopefully that rate of return adequately compensates you for what? One word, 4 letters, starts with an R. Risk. Okay? So every property that you may want to purchase has a different risk profile. Okay? That you have, let's say, a multifamily residential property like one we're describing here, which is, as a general rule, is among the least risky form of real estate investment there is, okay? As a general rule, okay? And the reason for that is because if somebody moves out, unlike with a big commercial property where you may have to spend months trying to find a tenant to occupy it, with a residential property, pretty much somebody moves out, you can probably have somebody moved in within 30 days or less, right? Assuming it's a decent property, decent location, blah, 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 okay? Now, but what might give one multifamily project more risk than another? In other words, if you were looking at 2 different 10-unit apartment complexes, what might give one of them more risk, meaning you would demand a higher rate of return than another?
Geological location.
Geological or geographical location. Geological might mean, underground versus,
Yeah,
but yes,
different level of the elevation.
geographical would be the correct response. Okay, that you have one in a bad area of town, one in a good area of town. Okay, simply put. All right, and so if the one in a good area of town, you might be willing to accept a 5% rate of return, okay, in a good area of town. But in a bad area of town, you might say, this place has a lot of risk because, number one, I may not get tenants. I may not get tenants I like. I may not get tenants that are able and willing to pay the rent on a monthly basis. I may be afraid to even go to the property to collect the rent because of all the problems and the issues, surrounding the property. So if that's the case, we might say, all right, instead of a 5% rate of return for the low risk, for a higher risk property, we might say, I demand an 8% rate of return. Now you're saying, where did I get that 8% versus the 5%? I pretty much just pulled that out of the air, okay? But in real life, what you would be doing, very much the same sort of, you're not necessarily pulling it out of the air, but what you are doing is trying to say, relative to this property, what would I perceive to be the relative risk between one versus the other? And there are all kinds of sophisticated ways that you can go about assessing that risk, but that goes beyond the scope of what we're doing with our little exercise here. So if we change that one variable, and we keep the income potentially the same, what does that do to the value? Now, before you do the calculation, do you think the value is going to go up as a result of that, or it's going to go down? How many of you say it goes up? How many of you say it goes down? Okay, good. The value goes down. All right. This shows me that you're a reasonably intelligent group. Okay, good. 70,850. I meant that as a compliment. Okay, 70,850 divided by 0.08, 885, 625. Okay.
That's run out.
Did the hurricane already hit?
No, it'll take 5 more days. 4.
Sunday night.
3.
Interesting.
They're probably testing this generator.
Okay. Well, let's see if we can put everything back on again. That was fun.
Flora said, we're just passing the hurricane.
Yeah, we're just testing here. I just use testing the generator.
Well, there's no self-sufficient anywhere.
So are we excited about the hurricane?
Hurricane parties, man.
I'll take a couple of seconds and put them all back up.
That's new. We haven't had that in the doing it twice. I had it 2 weeks ago on a Sunday afternoon.
Well, the part I'm worried about is if it burned the bulb out or something.
I think it was a whole thing.
No, I'm talking about that.
Oh.
Whether it burned because it's not powering on.
It's coming off.
There we go. Okay. So, getting back to this. All right, so what I was saying was assume that we had this property and it was in a worse neighborhood, therefore a higher, stay on record? Okay. But yeah, it's a battery backup, what am I thinking? Okay, so we have a property in a worse location, we have a higher risk associated with it, therefore we demand a higher rate of return. What is that going to do to the overall value of the property? It's going to reduce it, okay? Now, so what that's basically saying, bad neighborhood, you can buy a property that theoretically generates the same amount of income, but because of the risk associated with it, you would pay basically about $500-something thousand less for the property. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, which makes logical sense, okay? That if you buy a property in a bad neighborhood, now here's the thing. You're saying, well, wait a second, why would I not want to buy a property in a bad neighborhood if it's generating the same amount of income and potentially it's giving me a higher rate of return? Why would I not want to do that?
Because of the risk.
Well, because of the risk. Because the risk is that you may not get paid, that you may be paid late, that there may be other complications. But if you can manage that in the sense that you can do an above average job of making sure that tenants in that property, even though it's in a bad neighborhood, are good, solid, bill-paying tenants, then you may be able to find kind of quote unquote the diamond in the rough. Okay? The best properties I've ever owned have been in the worst possible neighborhoods. Okay? And what I mean by that is Class C, sort of what many of us would term as junk properties, in many cases have the highest rate of return. Okay? Because many people, number one, don't want to buy them. A lot of investors want to be able to brag about the properties they own. They want to talk about these absolutely gorgeous townhomes that they've invested in this beautiful area, and be able to, talk about, how wonderful, this neighborhood is that they've invested in. That's great, but it may actually be the real opportunity is not there. It's in areas that are less attractive as sort of a physical sort of environment. I'm not saying you need to live in these areas. I'm saying that many of the opportunities are in these stranger, lesser developed, tertiary sort of markets, okay? And part of the reason, in addition to the risk factor, is many times this is a perception. This perception of risk, okay? It's not necessarily actual risk, okay? And what I mean by that is if you walk into a quote-unquote bad neighborhood, how do many of us define that? Well, many of us may define that by just we sort of look around and we sort of say it's a bunch of sketchy property with people that are just sort of hanging out and, you know, maybe not employed, whatever the visions or the words are that you want to potentially use to describe that. But yet, the reality is, it may not necessarily be a bad area, it's just that we may perceive it that way. Here's another sort of, maybe even a better example. Most of you have probably been to Wynwood down in Miami, yes? Okay? At one point in time, Wynwood was what? The absolute armpit of basically Miami, all right? Then all of a sudden you had some folks come in initially, buy up some warehouses, start, you know, having different artists come in and to do some interesting things, and then you sort of begin to sort of turn the corner and change the perception of how people viewed Wynwood, and it went from being this super horrible, sketchy place to now it's this super hip, cool, artsy sort of community that has a lot of opportunity, and now it's overpriced.
The same thing happens in the row. It
happens almost everywhere. It basically, that investors like myself find undervalued properties that are centrally located with good, hopefully, other conditions associated with them, and they can see the future as to what you could reposition this into, and then ultimately transform it into something that becomes popular, and then ultimately sell out and move on. Okay, moving on. All right, so we get down really to this bottom question, all right, which is pretty much based upon the original valuation. And we say, assume that this property is priced by the seller, because we're the ones wanting to buy it, okay? This is our independent evaluation of what the property is valued at from our perspective as the investor. But assume the property is priced by the seller at $1.3 million. Should you potentially purchase this property? Why or why not? Okay? Give me your answers.
Are you looking at the value being 1.4 though?
I'm sorry?
Are you looking at the value at
Yes.
5%? Okay. There you go.
Okay? So, good investment, bad investment, based on those criteria. Good investment. Okay? Because we're saying, based upon our own independent evaluation, it's worth $1.4 million. But they've got it priced at $1.3 million. Right there, $300,000 differential. That works for us, but also, or I'm sorry, not $300,000, $100,000 differential, $117,000 differential. But also, can we afford it? Yeah. Because the very first part of our analysis was we can afford a property up to $1.5 million. Okay, if we have to pay 1.3, now here's the other thing. Just because the property is priced at 1.3 million doesn't mean that's what we're going to necessarily buy it for. We may end up being able to do some really good negotiations. I mean, Paul, I'm sure you could be an absolutely amazing negotiator and get them down to 1.2 million. Okay, and so automatically that's going to do what to our overall rate of return? Kick it up. Here's probably one of the most basic lessons of commercial investment real estate. You make more of your money as a developer and as an investor based upon the initial price you pay for the property than everything else. And what I mean by that is if you can find a property the land and or the building, if you're going to be repositioning it, that is somehow below market value whenever you buy it, you have a much greater chance of being able to develop that into something that's going to generate a substantial rate of return than if you just go out into the market and you start searching and you just find the average ordinary property priced at the average ordinary price. But you're going to be looking for those really unusual, quirky circumstances whenever you're searching for properties to buy. And what I mean by that, and this, I'll try to tone down the rhetoric a little bit, but basically, you're looking for situations of where bad things have happened to good people, okay? You're looking for properties that are part of a divorce. They've got to get rid of it. You're looking for situations of where someone has died and their estate has to get rid of it. You're looking for, situations of where the property's been foreclosed on because they weren't able to make the payments. Okay, whether it's tax lien foreclosures or the mortgage foreclosure. Those are going to be, in most instances where you're going to find a below market deal than just simply going out there, finding a realtor or getting on Zillow or many of the other LoopNet or whatever commercial sort of sites and looking for properties that are currently available. Or, it may be a situation of where it's a family connection, or it may be, there could be all sorts of ways that you go about finding those properties. But my point is, most of the time, your best bet of having a successful real estate investment project is going to be one where you find the property and you're able to purchase the property for a below market price. Does that make sense? Okay, that is the lesson, if there is one. Okay, any questions? Okay, so the first piece of this will be okay? Okay, it is pretty much right around 7 o'clock. Let's take a 5-minute break, okay? Then we're gonna come back and we're gonna hit the numbers really hard, okay? All right, take that 5-minute break, let's go.
So, that's kind of a door about driving down the neighborhood, picking on houses that haven't done landscaping for a while, and it was like successful. I think Steve told me that story about that. He still does that once in a while.
But it's true.
But knocking at people's doors.
Good question. I did
There are. But I do want it back.
Huh?
I do want it back.
Yeah, I got you.
But,
Mine came in today to the mail room, but they still didn't bring it.
Professor, I know people that have invested like in apartments down in Aventura, like 5 million, 10 million, and for them, basically, they are like a real estate investment. But I don't know how they really making money out of it.
In many cases, they're not.
No, they're not. Like
It's
like I could relate to what you were saying, like because it's a nice place. It doesn't make sense at all because I mean, if you're spending $10,000 a month,
sometimes it's ego. Sometimes it's like you got to park money for a variety of reasons. Yeah.
I don't know.
And some people put.
I mean, if you
some
invest,
people put that money down and hoping that the real estate investment itself, through the market going up, is gaining value rather than putting in other forms of financial investment.
yeah. I mean, what I say is like, if you have $5 million to invest, why are you investing like in one apartment? Why you don't get those $5 million invest in $200,000 house?
I had in April, I had an alumni of us from the Real Estate Masters Program present. And he is a construction manager for Moss. And he presented an example on the condo luxury apartments he did as a rehab. Buy the condo for $2 million, rehab it for $2 million. Like on a Saturday morning, that family made that mind up that they needed to change the kitchen countertops for $300,000.
Yeah, sure.
There's different volumes and
So what's
perception of money in
different?
this.
Yeah, what is different?
So last week I kept, when I taught the class, I kept saying it's hot in here.
Yeah, it's sweating.
And I played with the thermostat and it didn't kick in at all. But today you actually hear the air moving. So
Can you read that from back there?
yeah, I don't even have my glasses on. Well, I have to do it. Bottom left is maximum loan
Yep.
value. Yeah,
That'll work.
kind of guessing.
Well, the
it.
10 should be. They use the Craigslist offer on Facebook. eBay. I saw one of those, I think, 5 cars, I sold one on each. I sold my 6 cars, I sold them on Snapchat.
Did you just make these numbers up?
Yeah, in some cases, yes, but in other cases, you know, actually.
I told her, I'm a fucking bad. She told me, okay, I told her FaceTime, I'll show you how much. She never FaceTime me, so it was panic.
Is that,
He tried to fax her.
what does rent slash, PSF slash?
Mhm.
I told her, you see that one?
Per square foot.
Because I placed the value, it's 240. So she has charged to her. Shocks in the back.
Okay. Still missing anybody? Everybody? One person there?
Yeah.
That's it?
There, thank you. I'm not even close.
Okay. Go ahead and obviously pull out one of the other handouts that looks like what is up on the screen. And what I will do is I will be sending Dr. Wurtzer a Excel file containing all of this so that you can kind of play around with it on your own and that sort of thing. This one is meant to kind of help get into a little bit more detail beyond what we just did on kind of a simpler one. This is a little bit more complex, okay? Same general concept, but just a little bit more information, a little bit done, a little bit more analysis. All right? Everybody got it in front of them? Okay, let's go ahead and then get started. All right, so this is what I would call kind of a maybe mid-tier in terms of complexity, all right? What we just finished was pretty basic, you know, pretty rudimentary. This one includes a little bit more information, a little bit more detail, a little bit more analysis, and so we can kind of begin to kind of tinker around with some things a little bit more and kind of explain. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is kind of talk a little bit about the initial property. So this is obviously another multifamily property, another apartment community. In this case, we've got a property with 5 different unit types, okay? And in this case, we've got studio units, excuse me, 1 bedroom, 1 bath, 2 bedroom, 1 bath, 2 bedroom, 2 bath, and 3 bedroom, 2 bath, okay? Make sense, everybody? In terms of the unit base, all right? And for simplicity's sake, I just pretty much said, all right, we have 100 units for each of those unit types. Now, in practice, that's not going to be the case. You know, most of the time you're going to have a situation where, depending on the market and what is really being demanded within that market, that's going to impact that sort of unit mix. So for example, if you're in an extremely tight urban market, like let's just use San Francisco as an example, okay? Probably the tightest residential market of any market, I won't say in the world, but certainly in the US, okay? What unit mix do you think you would probably have almost exclusively? Studios. And super small ones, okay? Micro units, okay? In the sense of, you know, 150, 200 square feet, you know, tiny little, you know, barely the size of a hotel room, if that, okay? And everything all crammed in there, but at very high prices, okay? Why? Because super expensive real estate market, you've got to provide a product, and no one would be able to afford larger units. You know, you'd have to make so much money, there's no way you could afford the real estate, okay? Whereas you go to some hillbilly podunk town in the middle of nowhere, okay? You know, chances are you could have these massive, you know, units and pay almost nothing for them because, once again, the real estate costs there are nothing, okay? And, you know, so a totally different kind of mix. And then we're obviously somewhere probably on the upper end, but we're still, we're not nearly as expensive as obviously San Francisco and Fort Lauderdale and Miami, except there are certain parts of both cities that do have, you know, some fairly high-priced units. But all of that can be changed. The way this spreadsheet, when I built it, I set it up, every cell that's in yellow, that's a changeable cell. In other words, those are the cells that you can just easily update depending on the property and depending on the circumstances of that property, and then it'll automatically repopulate everything else, okay? Now, so starting off, we've got the units. Okay, here I've got the square feet, which is simply how large of a unit are we talking about? You know, how many, you know, square feet are in that unit, and that is simply, and that's a measure that also changes significantly, as we were just sort of saying, from one market to the next. You know, a normal studio unit probably within this market would be around 500 square feet. A normal one bedroom would be, you know, around 600 square feet. But the tighter the market, the smaller the units, okay? Make sense? But from a developer's point of view or an investor's point of view, you know, what you're really concerned with is ultimately what is going to be your rate of return on whatever you build. And that's where we're going to be coming to that a little bit later. So right now, let's just sort of see what we've got. Okay, here, this would be the rent that you'd be receiving for each of the units on a monthly basis. So the rent per month, per unit, okay? Everybody cool? All right. Now this next one is one that we did not do previously, which is used quite often kind of as an industry standard way of communicating between sort of property owners and investors for multifamily, and that is to quote the rent per square foot per month, okay? And so that way, once again, it makes it an easy apples to apples kind of comparison. So regardless of the actual size of the unit, we can have a pretty good idea of, all right, what are they really getting on a per square foot? And the reason why this number, excuse me, is so important is because think about it like this, okay? If you're building a property, the more square feet that you build, the more expensive that property is, okay? In terms of, whenever you quote construction prices, you quote them per square foot, okay? So the bigger the property, the more you're having to pay for construction costs. So you want to pretty much know what is the rent that you're able to get on every square foot of space that is in that property. Okay, does that make sense? So in this case, what are we sort of seeing here? Anybody want to kind of point out anything obvious?
Decreases as the square footage increases.
Okay, it decreases as the square footage increases. Any potential reason for that? Are you getting a bulk discount as a tenant? Not really. You sort of are, but not really. Why is it the per square foot cost would be less for a typically, for a 3-bedroom, 2-bath than it would be for a studio?
Because
On a per square foot basis.
Sure.
You could make the argument there's some cost inherent within just having roommates, you know, of just the uncomfortableness or the inconvenience potentially of having a roommate. But that's really not it. It is, but that's really not it. What really it boils down to is you have one kitchen. And the kitchen is pretty much the most expensive piece of the property in terms of residential, along with by the bathroom. Bedrooms cost nothing, okay? Open space, you know, I mean, in the sense of the infrastructure portion of it, okay? You know, a wide open space like this doesn't really cost a whole lot. Now you start putting in a kitchen, it's a lot of equipment, that's a lot of different electrical, mechanical systems, you know, whatever else that have to go in. Same thing, putting in a bathroom. Okay, all the plumbing and everything that you've got to put in, all the fixtures, okay? So there's a reason, a method to the madness on this, that even for that 1-bedroom studio, you still have to have a kitchen. You still have to have a bathroom, okay? That's the reason, to a certain extent, some of these, I wouldn't say they're brand new concepts, but they kind of are recycled concepts, that now we have this whole co-housing thing you've heard of, yes? Where it's basically, once again, in markets like San Francisco, New York, and even here in Fort Lauderdale, they've created now these units where basically you have a dorm room, but in that dorm room, you have nothing. In terms of, you don't have a bathroom, you don't have a kitchen, it's just a room, okay? And then you share a communal kitchen, and you share a whole suite of bathrooms, and they all get cleaned on a daily basis, you know, all that sort of thing. So the only thing that you really have to kind of watch out for is, you know, what you do in your own room. Does that make sense? Now, you're saying, I wouldn't want to live like that. Well, but, and I'm not saying you would, but if the cost to you is substantially cheaper, are you willing to put up with that? And so that's where, once again, the developer, the investor, is trying to sort of suss that out within a market. That concept would work in a market that is a very buoyant, very strong economic sort of market, but it's probably not going to work in some, once again, town, and I don't want to pick a state, I'll say Texas, but that's not true. But you know, think about a place in the middle of nowhere. It's probably not going to work.
Laramie, Wyoming.
Okay, Laramie, Wyoming. Okay,
We
fine.
work in Laramie because of the university.
But my point is simply one of, you've got to kind of, you know, think about some of the reasons why these numbers maybe are the way they are, and how that sort of translates into, you know, how a property maybe is developed and how it's structured. Okay, so moving on from there, we simply calculate what is the rent per year per unit, and there you're simply taking, in this case, the 1,000 times $2 per square foot per month times 12, and ultimate, or basically 1,000 times 12, all right, to get the 12,000. Does that make sense? So you're just taking whatever the rent per unit per month is, multiply by 12, get the rent per year per unit. And then to get the rent per year total for all of the units, then we're simply multiplying each of these by the respective number of units. Okay, make sense? Now the nice thing you'll be able to do, you know, once I send words to the spreadsheet and you guys can play around with it on your own, you just, you know, tinker around and see how it all kind of fits together and pieces together. Okay, now let's move on to some other aspects of this. But once we've got that, now just to make sure you're paying attention, this number, 8.4 million, based upon the previous example we worked, what is that number? Potential gross income, okay? All right, now what we're doing here, all of these yellow cells are assumptions. that are going to go into the model. And based upon what you do with these assumptions, in terms of changing them, dynamically changes everything in the model below, okay? So in this case, let's just look at some of these assumptions. Okay, one that we did not talk about previously because we didn't deal with a multi-year analysis in the previous problem is we're making the assumption we're going to have a 2% growth rate in rent every year. Okay, so let's just see if we can get to that number here in year 2. Does everybody follow kind of what I'm asking? So all you're going to do is you're going to take 8.4 million, which is year 1 potential gross income, yes? And if it has a 2% growth rate, this is where you're going to multiply it by itself, which is multiplying by 1, and then add in the growth rate of 2%, and then that should give you the 8,568,000. Does it? Okay. Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? So a simple test question might be, if your year 1 income is 8.4 million and you have a 2% growth rate, what would be the income in year 2? Does that make sense?
Yeah, this is the answer.
Yeah, that would be the answer. Okay? Now, what if we wanted to go to year 3? What would we do? Multiply this times 1.02. Okay, because now we're starting from what was the income in year 2 to get for year 3. And so that should then match up with the 8,739,360. Everybody follow? And so on and so forth. But basically, for the next year, same thing. So that should give you the 8,914,000, yeah, 147.20. Okay? Everybody cool? Any questions? Okay. Now, just I want to make sure that, I mean, you answered it all correctly, but I want to make sure, because this is usually a hang-up. Why do we have to put the 1 in front of the 02? Because you have to multiply it by itself, because if you just multiplied it by 0.02, that would just simply return 2% of the dollar amount, which is fine, but you'd have to then add it to that to get that. Does that make sense? This just simplifies the process, combines it. Okay? All right, moving forward. All right, so the next line item we have an assumption for vacancy and collection losses as a percent of PGI, 15%. Okay? So all you're going to do is for each year, you're going to go and you're going to simply, like for year 5, we picked that, you know, somebody said, year 5 PGI is 9,092,430.14. Multiply that by 15%. That should give us the vacancy and collection loss for that year. So in other words, the vacancy and collection loss changes with the income being generated. Does that make sense? Okay? In other words, we're not basing the 15% on just the original PGI. We're basing it on whatever that year's total income is. Okay? Everybody cool with that? All right. Other income, annual from parking, vending, all those sorts of things. So we start out in the first year, that other income is $200,000. But right below that, we have an annual growth rate for the other income Well, it's growing at a faster rate than the actual rental income. Does everybody follow that? So in other words, the other income. So this is growing at 3%. Okay? So you would simply take 200,000 times 1.03, and that's going to give you 206,000. Make sense? Okay, good? Okay, operating expenses. In this case, we're saying those are going to remain at 35% of whatever that year's effective gross income is. So for each year, you would just simply say, all right, we're going to take 35% of EGI for each year. So if we go all the way over here to year 6, if you were to type in 8,114,991.75 times 0.35, you should get 2,840,247.11. Make sense? Okay, everybody good? All right. Now, for the new stuff, okay? Is everybody good up to this point? Okay.
I got confused on the vacancy and collection loss.
Okay.
I don't know how to get to the 1,260,000.
Okay. So the vacancy and collection loss is a percentage of PGI. So it's 15%. So you're simply going to take 8.4 million multiplied by 0.15 or 15%, and that should give you the 1,260,000. And then each subsequent year, you just simply take whatever the PGI is for that year, multiply it by 0.15, and that's going to give you the vacancy and collection loss for that year. Okay? All right, we all good? Nice, warm, fuzzy feelings inside? Okay, all right, moving on. Okay, I'm just going to scroll down just a little bit here. Oops, a little bit too far.
I have like a kind of dumb question.
What?
I have a dumb question. We might have to get into it right now though. Why wasn't year 6?
Okay, I'm going to get into that. Okay, it's not a dumb question. It's actually a really good question because you're saying, well, why does this one thing not look like the other?
Yeah, I see.
Which is a logical question to ask, and I promise you we're going to get into it.
Okay.
Okay, all right. Now we've got a few extra lines that you haven't seen before. Okay, in our previous example, we stopped here at NOI. Yes? Okay, now we've got 2 more lines to contend with. Subtract out ADS, which stands for annual debt service, which is basically, that is your loan payment, principal and interest, which we're going to get into as well, okay? Then, once you subtract that from your NOI, that leaves you with before tax cash flow, BTCF. And so that is the number that you would have that, once again, if we've got 17 or 16, however many different investors in here in this project, and we were all jointly involved in the ownership of this project, we would all, pretty much, if we were at equal positions, we would equally share the before tax cash flow. But then what would happen is each of our individual tax implications would kick in, and depending on our marginal tax rate, then that would dictate how much we pay in income tax. And that goes beyond what we're going to do, okay? We're only getting down to just before tax cash flow. That we get into all the tax implications, which that in and of itself, in the courses I teach, that takes up a good 8 hours just to get into all the tax stuff, okay? So that's why we're not going to do that. All right, now, so let's just talk a little bit about what we've got going on here with this annual debt service and how that relates to these 2 assumptions up here. Minimum debt service coverage ratio allowed by the lender based on year 1 NOI. And then we have this other maximum loan to value ooh, it should not be ration, it should be ratio, allowed by the lender. Let's fix that right now. All right, now, let's start with the second one first, the loan to value ratio. We've already done that tonight, haven't we? That was almost like one of the very first things that we did. Literally was the very first thing we did. And we said, you know, what is basically the required down payment or the required equity, and what is the resulting debt that we would be able to have on the property. So this maximum loan to value, LTV ratio allowed by the lender, 75%, means what in terms of equity? So that would be the debt, 75%. The equity would be 25%. Okay, does that make sense? Yes or no? I know you're getting a little tired. We've got a long way to go and a short time to get there. Okay? All right. Now, let's get back to the debt service coverage ratio and what that means. Okay. There's a very simple formula for the debt service coverage ratio, and that is, it is the net operating income divided by the annual debt service. Okay? Now, let's just think about what that means and let's do a calculation and try to explain it and put it in context, and then you'll have it forever. Okay? So let's just start off. The NOI for that year is $4,771,000. Okay? Yes? If you read what I wrote up there, minimum debt service coverage ratio allowed by lender based on year one NOI. Okay, so year one NOI is this $4,771,000. Okay. So what I've given you as our minimum debt service coverage ratio is 1.3. Okay, that's what's a given. So what you're solving, excuse me, what you're solving for is the annual debt service. Okay, so let's just put that in. You're going to take the 4,771 divided by 1.3, and that's going to give you 3,670,000. Yes? Do I get that? What?
That would be your annual debt service.
And that would be your maximum annual debt service. Now, at this point, I don't expect you to even have a clue as to what that means. That's okay. That's what I'm about to explain. All right? So, let's put our lender hat on for a second. As a lender, what's your number one concern whenever you make a loan? To you get paid back, yes? That you get paid back and you will hopefully make a profit. But the big one is you get paid back. Okay. So what's one of the things that you're scared of? You're scared of not being paid back. What will help alleviate that fear of not getting paid back? Collateral. But another thing that will alleviate that fear is not allowing the borrower to borrow too much money. Does that make sense? Yes or no? In other words, let's keep it simple here for a second. Let's say, for simplicity, you make $100,000 a year in salary. All right? You've got a whole bunch of different expenses. You've got, you know, maybe a car loan. You've got a potentially you're going to have a home loan. Let's say you're going to have student loans. You're going to have food expenses, entertainment expenses, whatever. When you go to get a home loan, the lender is going to say the standard that they normally apply is maybe 30 to 35% of your gross income can be applied to basically a mortgage payment. So what that means is that if you're making $100,000 a year, they'll probably allow you somewhere between $30,000 to $35,000 to be allocated toward a mortgage payment. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay, then we break it down a little bit further, and you sort of say, okay, let's just be conservative, and let's say it's $30,000 a year. Okay, if it's $30,000 a year, divided by 12, that'd be $2,500 a month. Okay, so what you're basically saying is, as a lender, we are not going to allow you to have mortgage payments in total that are greater than $2,500 a month, because we don't want you to be in default on this loan, and we know you have all these other expenses, so we're putting an upper cap on what you can borrow. Does that make sense? Yes, no, possibly could be. The same exact thing is true with the commercial loan. But the difference is, and this is where it's interesting, the commercial loan on this property has to pretty much stand on its own. And what I mean by that is they're not basing this commercial loan on how much you're earning off of your salary on your day job. They're basing this loan off of the income this property is generating each and every year, or expected to generate each and every year. Does that make sense? Yes, no, possibly could be. Okay, so we have made, now keep in mind, all of these are projections, okay? We're saying this is a new property that we're buying that may or may not have been occupied before. You know, that could help if you have operating history, but in this case, we're saying this is a brand new property, just been built, and we're buying it or want to buy it, and you know, here are the projections for the income and the expenses. So, we've made assumptions about how much rent we can charge. We've made assumptions about what our vacancy and collection losses are going to be. We've made assumptions about what other income we can generate. We've made assumptions about what operating expenses we're going to have on this property. Okay, so all of that is an assumption minus an assumption plus an assumption equals an assumption minus an assumption equals another assumption. Does everybody follow that? In other words, these are not necessarily hard, fast numbers, okay? And that's the reason I want to make sure that's clear in your mind. Okay, so what the lender is saying, okay, you've made all these wonderful assumptions, and they're hopefully accurate assumptions, but we still don't trust you, okay? And so we know that even if all of your assumptions are correct, the maximum money that you have available to pay us in terms of a mortgage would be this $4.7 million. That's the maximum money that you have available. But they're saying, we're not going to allow you to get that large of a mortgage payment. We are going to basically haircut that. And in this case, the haircut is this debt service coverage ratio. And so the haircut that they're imposing, if you can kind of do the simple math, is a 30% haircut. So they're basically saying, we want a 30% cushion so that if your income were to go down by as much as 30%, you can still pay us. Does that make sense? Yes or no? It's a long-winded explanation to get to what it actually means, but I think it's important for you to be able to understand that's what it basically boils down to. Now, if it was a debt service coverage ratio of a 1.25, would that be more conservative or less conservative from the perspective of the lender?
Less.
It would be less conservative, meaning they trust you more, okay? They trust your numbers more. Now there's some projects, if they are truly golden, in the sense of, you know, it's like magical, mystical forces have aligned in the universe and everything is, you know, just as possibly wonderful as it could ever be, you might see that number go as low as a 1.1, 1.15, 1.2, okay? And pretty much what that means, if it goes to a 1.1, that's only a 10% cushion. Okay, you follow me? Now, in crazy, uncertain, weird, strange economic times, that number can go as high as 1.5, 1.6. Now that's where it gets crazy, because there, you're pretty much saying, you're pretty much saying, I want a 50% cushion as a lender or a 60% cushion because I really think this project doesn't have legs. That, you know, there's potentially some real problems that I foresee as the lender maybe on the horizon for this project. But normalcy is around a 1.3, you know, 1.25, 1.35, okay? Does that make sense? Yes, no, possibly, could be. Okay, but if you remember back what I also said at the very beginning of tonight, every lender is a fill in the blank, starts with an R. Every lender is different because they are, I can't remember, I don't know how many letters it is. They're a retailer, okay? Every lender is a retailer, all right? And so therefore, you can probably shop around from one lender to the next and potentially find a different debt service coverage ratio. Does that make sense? Which would impact the total amount that you would be able to borrow, okay? Are we good? All right, so here's what's interesting about this. Have we talked about an interest rate? Have we talked about a loan term? Have we talked about any of that? No, because that's not what the lender is looking at. They're looking at this strictly based upon what dollars are being generated by the property and what dollar amount are they willing to say to you, we want from you each and every year. Does that make sense? So what we're going to have to do is back into what is for this annual debt service, what would be the maximum loan amount based upon the interest rate, based upon the term. Does that make sense? And that's where this handy dandy thing begins to be critically important, okay? All right, so in terms of the basic math, I think you all obviously understand subtraction. So from the standpoint of getting down to our before tax cash flow number, that represents basically the cushion, okay? This amount left over represents how much really your income could reduce, you know, before you wouldn't be able to pay your annual debt service. Does that make sense? Are we good with that? Because from your perspective, as the borrower, you may just be saying, I don't really care to a certain extent what my rate of return is. I may just be buying this property because I'm just simply looking for a place to park my money for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I'm not really looking to make any cash flow off of it. So as long as I'm breaking even and pretty much getting something above zero here, I'm okay. Does that make sense? But that's something, you know, on a personal level that, you know, you're dealing with. But from the lender's perspective, they want to make sure there's a cushion there. Okay. Are we all good up to this point? All right. Moving forward. So now, this next little piece is where we begin to take into consideration what is the interest rate, what is the term, and then everything that kind of flows from that. So here, we have made the assumption that we have found a lender that is willing to give us a 4.5% interest rate on our loan and a 25-year term, okay? Now, once again, you go to one lender, they may give you a 4% interest rate with, let's say, a 20-year term. Or another lender that may give you a 5% interest rate with a 30-year term. You know, every lender is going to be a little bit different, okay? And maybe a lot different. That's my point with the whole retail aspect of this. Okay, but your more interesting question at this point is, what do we do with these numbers and how does this all sort of relate to all this stuff above? All right, so what we've got to do is we've kind of got to back solve into some of these numbers. And just gonna now in Excel, we've got a variety of little formulas that we use to get at these calculations. I'm not necessarily going to go through this and really, because it really doesn't relate to what you're going to be tested over, but I want to kind of explain a couple of things. So what we're solving here, this is going to relate to the calculator. We're solving for what is the loan amount, or what we're going to refer to on the calculator and in Excel as our present value. Okay, what is the value of this loan worth in today's dollars? Okay, and in Excel, the variables they've got up here, and you can't really see that in the back, and it's okay. But the first one represents what is the interest rate. And then we divide that by 12 to make it a monthly interest rate. Then the next one is number of periods. Well, that means how many months or how many years. So in this case, it's 25 years times 12 months in a year, or 300 months total. All right. Then we've got what is the payment amount. All right. And so whatever that monthly payment is, or annual payment is, which we've got right here, annual debt service, and divide it by 12 to get a monthly payment. Okay? All right. So now let's just see if we can do what they've done here, but with a financial calculator. Okay? Let's see if we can sort of match up. All right. So here's what I want you to do. We've got the number right there in front of us. This 55 million. So I'm going to switch over back to the laptop here for a second so I can write on the screen. All right. Okay, break out the calculator. And the first thing I want you to do, we're going to do some preliminary stuff with the calculator to kind of get you acclimated to the calculator. Then we're going to do that problem. And then we're going to do a bunch of other problems, okay? So the first thing I want you to do, turn on the calculator, and then I want you to do the following. I want you to hit the gold key that is the shift key, and then right below it, you're going to see clear, or C, and then in orange, right below that, on that same key, you're going to see all, or clear all. Does everybody see that on the calculator? So basically, every time that I put this little solid box up here, that means shift, okay? And that means we're accessing basically what is, in this case, in orange on the calculator. All right? Now, if you hit that, shift, and then you hold down the see all, the clear all button, you hold it down for just a second, it's going to say either 12p year, or it's going to say 1p year, or something else. How many of you say, how many of yours says either 1p year or 12p year?
12p.
Okay. How many of you has something different? Okay, 1 or 12. 1 or 12 is why what goes. Now what that means is if it's 1p year, that means your calculator is currently set for 1 payment per year, or annual compounding. Okay? And that means that you would make or receive a payment every 12 months. Does that make sense? Whereas if it's set on 12p year, that means it's currently set for monthly payments, like most everything is in reality. Okay? You make a monthly mortgage payment, you make a monthly car payment, you make a monthly credit card payment, and so 12p a year is the normal. Now, are there other compounding periods? Yes. But 99% are either going to be probably annual or they're going to be monthly. And most of them are going to be monthly. The others might be, those of you that have ever taken a finance course, you've maybe heard of quarterly compounding. You've heard of semi-annual compounding. You've heard of basically, what am I looking for? Continuous compounding. So there's all these other sort of compounding periods. We're not going to concern ourselves with those. With real estate, it's either going to be annual or it's going to be monthly, okay? So, for this problem, we want to focus on monthly. So to set your calculator appropriately, what you're going to do is you're going to type in 1, 2, 12, shift, and then you're going to look on the top row of the calculator, and underneath the payment key, the PMT key, you see P/YR. Okay? Especially if your eyesight's better than mine, you can still see it. I can't see it anymore. I just remember from years ago, that's what used to be there. Okay? So what that is going to do for the calculator is that is going to change whatever the current setting is, whether it's already set for 12 payments per year or set for 1 payment per year to 12 payments per year. So to check it to make sure that it made that change, once you type that in, now hit the shift clear all, and it should now, everybody should be on 12p a year. Yes? Okay? If you're not, you need to tell me now, because this isn't going to go well. Okay.
I'm not sure if I have it.
Okay.
Go and check this.
Yeah.
Once again, shift and then the C-call on the bottom. Shift, then double check it. You're right. Up for you.
Okay.
Wait, up.
All right. Now, once we've gotten that, all right, let's kind of go back to this problem, and we're gonna come back and do some much simpler problems, but we're gonna start with this one just to kind of explain, kind of how this all works. All right. So once we've got that, let's take a look at the sheet and what information that we've been given. Okay. So the first thing we can do is we can put in the interest rate. So we're gonna put in 4.5. And then we're going to hit the interest rate key, which is also the top row of the calculator. I divided by, it's the second key over, okay? I divided by year. Okay, so you're going to type in 4.5, I divided by year. Got it? Okay, now for the loan term, you're going to type in 25, and then you're going to hit the shift key. I'll explain this. Then you're going to hit N or the term key. Now, whenever you do that, what should pop up in your display is 300. Okay? And what that means is the calculator has made the conversion for you from 25 years to 300 months. Okay? Does that make sense? Because it knows the calculator is now set for 12 payments per year. Okay? Are we good? Okay, everybody matching up with everything I've told you so far? Okay. Now, in this case, we're told that our maximum annual debt service can be $3,670,000. Okay? And that is our, once again, our maximum annual debt service. But because even though on this sheet it looks like it's annual, we're still making monthly payments, okay? So that's one little thing that may throw you off a little bit, but don't get thrown off by that. Just realize you're making monthly payments, all right? So what we need to do is take that number and simply divide it by 12 to get our monthly debt service. Okay? So 3670.
So should we clear what we have in the calculator?
No, it'll be fine. Trust me. And then so that gives us a monthly debt service of 305 83333. Okay?
That's your monthly.
Monthly.
Mine did not.
So you get that for every single.
Did you just put 36 on
All you have to do is don't do anything more than what I put up here on the board. All you're doing is taking 367,000 divided by 12 to give us 305,83333. Is everybody good with that? Yes or no? Okay, now then, once that number is in your display, you don't have to retype it. Okay, all we're gonna do is we're gonna have that over here, but you don't retype it, don't clear the display. I'm just gonna write it over here. And what you're gonna do is you're going to put that as payment. So once the 305,83333 is in your display and the calculator, just simply hit the payment button. Nothing more. Okay, everybody got that? Don't do any more, don't do any less than what I've got up here on the board. Okay?
So 305,833 payment, should that number?
0.33, yes, payment. And then it should just kind of pop back up as 305,833.33. Okay, now, this is where the magic should happen. Simply hit, now, the PV button, present value. If you have done everything I asked you to do, you should get negative 55,022,572,83. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, now then, let's take a look.
Is that a slightly different number?
I got it slightly different.
Okay, the reason you would have gotten a slightly different number is you didn't do exactly what I asked you to do.
It's like off by like $1 and.
Yeah.
Okay, here's what I would, okay, first of all, are all of your calculators kicked out to 9 decimal places?
Yes.
Or is it just at 2 decimal places?
Ours is at 2.
Okay, when you first buy the calculator, it's set for 2 decimal places. That's going to be the reason. Okay, let's change that. It's a good thing to have to fix. Okay, because you never want it set for 2 decimal places. All right, so on your calculator, do as follows. Hit Shift, and then you're going to hit the equal key, but what you're actually doing is you're accessing what's below it, which is DISP, display. And then you're going to type 9. And what that's going to do is it's going to kick out your decimals to 9 decimal places, so it's not going to automatically round everything off. Okay, now, once you've done that, now let's go back, put in everything again, or it's possible you may be able to just resolve for present value and it may fix the problem. It depends on what it rounded off and what it didn't.
Let's do it.
I still got the same.
Okay, in that case, put everything back in and it should fix the problem. It's a good exercise to go back through. Now the way, okay, hold on, one more thing. Whenever I say put everything back in, I mean only everything on this side. So in other words, but I want you to start with the Shift Clear All. Here's the thing, you asked a question earlier and you said, well, do I have to clear this out? Do I have to do anything? And I said no.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. With a financial calculator like this one, whenever you put in this information over here, all this loan information, that information stays there forever until the battery dies, okay? Unless you change it. So in other words, if you were to do this problem, turn it off, pick up the calculator, 5 years later, that problem is still going to be in there because it's been saved, okay? So the only way to clear out the calculator between problems is to hit the Shift Clear All. And that clears out all the memory registers, so you're starting with a fresh palette. Okay, does that make sense? Yes or no? Because if you fail to do that, and all you hit, now this is mission critical, if you only hit the clear key without hitting the shift key, the clear key only clears out what is in the display. It doesn't clear out all of the memory registers. And the reason for that is because let's say that you're working with a really complex, and this one's pretty basic, but let's say you're working with a really complex problem where you put in a lot of different information and then you just happen to hit the wrong button, you type in 0.45 instead of 0.54, well, this allows you just to clear out what's in the display without having to re-enter everything all over again. Does that make sense? Okay? All right. So once again, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page, redo this and you should end up with the same answer.
I still don't have that number.
Yeah, it's got the same thing too.
Okay. Double check.
I got that one.
Only one person. 12. I'm just redoing all the stuff until it comes out right. P.
I'm getting this number. Then again, oh, I know what it could be. Okay. I put it in just simply as this, but if you had put it in with this and then just immediately followed it with a payment, it would have not rounded off anything. That's why.
It would not have?
Right.
So wait, if I, what if I?
So no, let's put it this way. When we're dealing with this amount of a fractional difference, we're not going to concern ourselves. Okay? Just be careful of the rounding in the sense of really just don't even bother rounding. Regardless of what you've been taught in all of your previous years, don't bother with the rounding because really, the honest to God truth is, in reality, whenever it comes to most of these calculations, they really don't round. And the reason they don't round, or they do round ultimately to the nearest like penny or whatever, but the simplest way to explain this is the lender tries to get as much money out of you as they possibly can. So in most cases, if it works to their favor, they may round up. Just don't round. Okay? All right.
Yeah, it still goes up some.
Okay. So are we finally arriving at this number by just putting in the information as written here? Yes or no?
I'm
still not
getting
getting
that number. I'm getting 73.4297.
You're typing it in precisely as this.
Yeah.
Like not even something.
I'm getting like negative 7 million.
Okay. Well, it's just, I'm gonna do it right here in front of you. Okay. So 4.5 interest rate, 25 years,
What?
Are you getting that number?
305,
I'm getting that number without the
33.33
rounding. I get
33
like 570.
payment,
4297.
and present value.
That's what it says on the paper.
Yeah, so like you said, because he presented it without the calculation
Okay.
rounded.
What?
Rounded itself.
Okay, let me look at yours.
Yeah, because I just, okay, let me.
Okay, let's start from scratch. Shift. All right. So we type in 4.5 and interest rate 25.
So yeah,
Shift in
3,670,000 divided by 12.
and
Yeah, you just did it
305.
Just did it with the
Yeah.
You know, the
305.
833.
Point
Because then when I did it that way.
Yes. And we're going to hit payment, and then we're going to hit present value.
Okay, so when you type, so I didn't type in that number, I actually like did something.
Okay, yeah, that's why I said type it in. Yep, yep.
Okay. Because when I type in the and then get.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
Well, instead of each
Interest rate.
Which is why it rounded.
25, shift in,
I click it, just goes.
okay,
Because I figured it's probably.
305,
that's
833.33 payment, so present value.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody else got it? All right, now, what you should see is we go back to our handout here for a second, all right? It's not absolutely the same as the Excel spreadsheet, and the reason it's not is because of rounding, okay? But in the Excel spreadsheet, it's 573.43, here it's 572.83. And the reason is purely due to rounding. okay? So don't get hung up on that, all right? That's not gonna make the problem right or wrong in terms of the answer, okay? Okay, so, everybody good up to that point? All right, now, let's take a look at the next piece of this. All right, so if that is, in this case, the loan amount, and we are able to, in essence, from that, say that the down payment was what percent for this property? 25%.
Yeah.
Okay? So in this case, if this is the loan amount, that represents 75% of the total, correct? Or 75% of the value. So we can simply take this amount divided by 0.75, and then that should give us the implied value of the property. Or $73,363,430.44 using a calculator. $431.24, obviously, in Excel due to rounding. Okay? Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? So in other words, that number represents the value. Oops. Okay? Everybody good? Okay, we're gonna do a couple of quick more things and we'll take another break. Okay? All right. So, once we've got the implied value of the property, the next thing that I have down there is an implied cap rate. Okay? But it's interesting because that implied cap rate seems to be a fixed number and not something we input. So let's take a look at that. Let's go back to the PC, to the Excel, just to see what's going on there. Okay, so whenever you sort of blow up that cell, the implied cap rate of 6.5%, whenever you click on that, it blows up two cells, NOI and implied property value. So what it's doing is it's calculating its own cap rate based upon what that implied value is and what the NOI is off the property. Just like we had done previously in terms of the first example we did. Does that make sense? So in other words, it's ERV, okay? So in this case, the income is the 4771000. The value of the property is the 73 million. So that divided by the 73 million, do the calculation. Okay, do it on your calculator. 4771000 divided by.
Do we have to clear all for this?
Yes,
Yeah.
they're all, no problem. Divided by 73,363,431.24, and what you get is 0.065032399. But what matters, we're rounding, and we're just simply saying it is 6.5%. Does that make sense? Okay, so just to make sure you're paying attention, you're still awake, you're still engaged. What does that mean? 6.5%. What is that telling us? That is the cap rate, but it's also the annual sort of rate of return that we're really getting off of this property. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Are you seeing why it made sense to do the simple problem first and then to do this one next? Because hopefully you got kind of the fundamentals with the simple problem, and this kind of notches it up a step or two in terms of extra information that would have probably like made your brain explode, you know, first time through. Not that that's not happening right now, but at least maybe it's a little bit slower of a brain explosion. Okay, so required equity. This is also something else that just is being calculated by the spreadsheet. What do you think they're doing here?
Is that like based on the 75% of the
It is. And so all they're really doing, in this case, since we've already got these two numbers calculated, they can just subtract one from the other. You know, and simply say, okay, if the total value of the property is 73 million and the loan amount is 55 million, 73 minus 55 gives us the 18. Or you just could take the 73 million times 0.25, give you the same answer.
That's your required down payment. So
Correct. We're talking required down payment, required equity, however you want to look at it. Okay? We'll be good with that. Yes or no? Okay? Now the next one is something we haven't talked about yet. Good. And we're gonna talk about this and we'll take a break. This one is called the before tax return on equity. Okay? Before tax return on equity, which is simply taking your before tax cash flow divided by your initial equity investment. Now this is also referred to.
Wait, I'm sorry, it's what? By what?
Okay, it's right here on the spreadsheet.
Oh, it's here, okay.
It's your before tax cash flow divided by your equity. This is also referred to in a lot of textbooks and you know, different people sort of sometimes call things different things. But you'll also hear people refer to it as your cash on cash return. Okay, the reason why it would be called a cash on cash return is, in essence, that is the cash that's being generated by the property divided by the cash that you put into the property. Make sense? Okay, so some people just think of it a little bit differently, but it's just simply before tax return on equity. Okay, it's for the more formal name if you have to say. Okay, now, so in this case, all you're doing, you're going to take the before tax cash flow, 1,101,000. Okay, divided by your equity of 18,340,857.81, and you get 0.0600 blah blah blah. Okay, so 6%. So what that's telling you is that after you have taken into account your loan, okay, that's different than the cap rate, okay? With the cap rate, you can kind of make the assumption there is no loan because it only goes down to net operating income, okay? And your rate of return was 6.5%. But with your loan, your rate of return on a before tax basis for just that year's worth of income is 6%. Okay, does that make sense? Cash on cash. Here's a way to sort of think of it. There are different measures, different ratios, all of which mean something a little bit different, but are maybe more meaningful to one person than another, depending on how they're looking at that particular problem or that particular investment. Okay? So I'm just trying to provide you with a variety of these. Okay, so what we're gonna do is take about a 5-minute break, come back, and then we'll kind of continue on, talk about the resale cap rate and so forth, and then we've got a bunch of time value money problems to work through. So, and the purpose of the time value money problems is to get you super familiarized with how to use the calculator. Okay? All right, get out of here, take a 5-minute break. Be back at 8:15. Turn that back.